As part of Metrobank's partnership with England Cricket, 3 England women's players met with Sophie Brown of Food by Sophie in Bristol to talk about her inspiration and Metrobank support for women in cricket and in business. Head to Metrobank's social channels to see what happened when Sophie cooked up some Jamaican dishes for Lauren Bell, Kate Cross and Sarah Glenn. Hello and welcome to the Wisden Women's Cricket Weekly Podcast. It is T20 World Cup week this week. All we'll be doing is previewing the T20 World Cup that starts tomorrow. I'm Yas Rana, and with me today is Katya Witney. In part 1, you'll hear from Lauren Winfield-Hill, who, among other big calls, doesn't think Australia will make the final. And in part 2, Katya and I will tell you about some players to watch. Here's part 1 with Lauren. We're only a couple of days away from the start of the T20 World Cup. Let's quickly go through the groups first. So Group A, you've got Australia, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and New Zealand. In Group B, England, South Africa, West Indies, Bangladesh and Scotland. Lauren, the 4 semi-finalists in 2023 were Australia, India, England and South Africa. Do you see that 4 advancing to the semi-finals again?
Short answer, yes. I think on paper they would be the strongest 4 teams to progress through the tournament. I think different challenges are presented in the conditions of the UAE. Like we've spoken about that a lot, but I think certainly on world-class performers across those 4 teams, and if you were going to select, there could be some surprises in there, like Deandra Dottin back at in the West Indies fold boosts them dramatically. We all know the power that Hayley Matthews possesses when she's on song. So there could definitely be some shake-ups. But if I was to sort of have a bit of a stab of who I think would be in the semi-finals, they would be the 4 teams.
It's quite interesting that, there's not very long between the 2 World Cups and there's not been that much cricket played. So looking at teams' records, one team might have a pretty low win percentage, but that might be because of who they've played against, just because it's not been very long. But even still, looking at some teams, I think West Indies are quite interesting since the last World Cup. They've won 3 out of the 4 series they played. The one series they lost was against Australia, and in that series they nicked a game. You mentioned Matthews. I think it's just worth saying how ridiculous she's been since the last World Cup. So 758 runs at 58. The next best West Indies player, Shemaine Campbell, has 216 runs. And, Dottin coming back, it's a potentially quite a big deal for them. We don't know exactly where she's at. You'd have played against her recently in the CPL, but she's not played international cricket since the Commonwealth Games 2 years ago.
Yeah, no, she we saw her about at 3 in the first game in the CPL, and she got boosted up to open, sort of probably when the tournament was in a bit of a crunch. And it sort of felt like she was like, right, this game means a lot. I want to open the batting. So yeah, it'll be interesting where she bats. I mean, I don't think she likes waiting to bat. I think her preferred role is to open the batting and to, I think sometimes people, those kind of potent, destructive players, people think that they don't need any balls to get going. But actually, the way that she played in the CPL and even how we saw her play before that, she is still someone that likes to find her feet at the crease. She's quite often 20 off 20 and then goes, flicks the switch and fancies a bowler, and she's quickly on 40 off 25. So I think she quite like that little bit of extra time to just find her feet in the middle. But I guess the conundrum with the West Indies is how do you extend that order? Where does Stefani Taylor bat? Because she obviously likes to bat 3. And, even somebody like Chanel Henry, who was always a bowler that sort of had a bit of a pinch hit down the order. She played really nicely in the warm-up game for them, and she's somebody that could come up the order and I guess then create space for Deandra to open the batting with Hayley. I'm a big believer in let your best batters do the heavy lifting. Like you obviously want to extend your order whereby you can encourage people to play positive cricket, but the last thing you want to do is to be plugging gaps and then batters chew up 20 balls that some of your best players could have used. So yeah, I think she's a massive addition. And I think, West Indies in World Cups as well, they're always that team that you just think if they're up for it and they're about and they're singing and dancing and the energy's high, they can steal a game off anyone.
And what's really interesting there with West Indies is that the first game that they play is against South Africa in a day game on Friday. So arguably the biggest game of the group stage for both those sides is straight up. And, you tend to get, I guess, slightly less predictable results at the very start of a World Cup with teams just acclimatizing to conditions, etc. South Africa finalists in 2023, such a big deal, so much celebration around that, them doing that on home turf first. South African side, men's or women's, to get to a World Cup final. Slightly turbulent year and a half since then. There's been confusion over the coaching. Results haven't been great. They nicked a game against Australia, but otherwise not great results. I mean, on Group B, would you expect England to go through with a 100% record and actually, would almost be disappointed not finishing top of that group?
Yeah, I think the expectation would be that England sort of come out on top in that group. I think for me, South Africa, it's how big the big players go. I think for a long time we've sort of seen their success be based around your Laura Wolfarts, your Marizanne Caps. We're seeing a little bit more from like Tasmin Brits, and Sune Luce has seemed to be in slightly better form. She was being pretty quiet for a couple of years. But I think it's basically how big the big dogs go for South Africa. Whereas, for England, I think they've got match winners throughout the team, both with bat and ball. But equally, some of the players in the South African lineup, Laura Wolfart's been in the form of her life. And I think the nature in which her style of play has shifted as well. If she has a good tournament, I think as well, the other thing with the South African results of late, obviously there's been a little bit of turbulence with the coach and things like that. But Marizanne Cap quite often doesn't play in a lot of the series. And if she does, she doesn't always bowl. Obviously played with her a lot at the Oval Invincibles. And I know that sort of to give her longevity in international cricket, the deal is, that there's certain series she won't play. There's certain series that she'll just play as a batter because she is always managing a bit of a niggle with her back. So I almost feel like you've got to take the results of what they've done in the last year based on cap in or cap out, because the side is very different.
Yeah. In Group A, arguably, I think most people consider that the stronger of the two groups. We talked about Sri Lanka, obviously, when we had Chamari Atapatu on the pod. They've had such an amazing development in the last couple of years, beating England in England last year, winning the Asia Cup. And we don't know exactly what conditions will be like, but in theory, these conditions could suit Sri Lanka.
Yeah, they've been, they've been fantastic and probably a little bit opposite to, I guess, what we speak about with South Africa in terms of how big do the big dogs go is actually the real strength has been the contributions that they've had from other players, and that's been their biggest area of growth is we obviously were lucky enough to speak to Chamari Atapatu, and she spoke about it's been a journey to give girls opportunities in Sri Lanka to train more, to have more contracts, to improve domestic cricket, sort of the girls coming through. And it was a bit of a 2-year project. And now we're sort of seeing that come to fruition now with lots of other players putting their hand up and contributing. Because I think T20 cricket is different. If somebody has a day out, you can win a game single-handedly. But that's not going to consistently win you an awful lot of games, because you think somebody comes off a red hot day, they get 80 off 40 or 100 off 65 or whatever. We know that Chamari Atapatu is perfectly capable of that, but that might happen 1 in 10. So what do you do in the other, the other 9 games? Is the shared load of what the other girls are contributing, and that's what we're starting to see a little bit more from Sri Lanka.
And New Zealand also in that group. New Zealand, a quite interesting story in general. Just 5 wins out of 22 since the last World Cup. If you look back at the history of global events, 10, 15 years ago, they were always there and thereabouts. They got to the first 2 finals of the T20 World Cup, always thereabouts in 50 of World Cups. But actually in the last 8 years, I don't think they've got to the semi-finals, let alone a final, despite still having a number of very well-established big-name players who play a lot of franchise cricket around the world. There seems to be a little bit of a low ebb at the moment.
Yeah, I feel like when I think about New Zealand cricket in the last few years, it's like when your mum says that she's not angry, she's just disappointed. It's like it sort of feels a little bit like world cricket's moving forward and they haven't. And I don't feel like I'm speaking out of line saying that, because I think it'd be quite easy to back that up with trends, results, records broken, etc. And it sort of feels like they've obviously got some world-class players that have been around for a long time, and they're still so reliant on them, where other teams have gone, like it seems like a nice progression, actually, this conversation where it's like Sri Lanka, okay, they've invested in the growth of the game the last few years, and now we've got lots of contributions from lots of different players. New Zealand feels the reverse of that. I think we haven't really unearthed a huge amount more than what we've already known is there. Amelia Kerr, Jess Kerr, Leah Tahuhu's been around for a long time. We've seen Lee Kasperick now for a long time, Sophie Devine, Susie Bates. There's nobody that's really stealing headlines apart from the ones that we've been so used to seeing be the headline acts for the last 10 years. So it just sort of feels a little bit like, yeah, there's obviously something going on in New Zealand with the investment and domestic cricket and things like that of, okay, well, where is that? Because players coming through are not, they don't look hugely ready for international cricket straight up. I think someone like Georgia Plimmer lines up really well. Like, she looks like she could be a really decent bat, but I think she averaged about 9 in England. So it's pretty hard going straight up. And they're young players, and you give them a few years, but you sort of don't have a few years because Susie Bates might not be around in a few years. So yeah, it sort of feels like lots of countries have kicked on. And even just things like, franchise comps is, the West Indies have a franchise competition. There's talks about, a competition coming in Sri Lanka, England have it, Australia have it. And I wonder the impact of actually, hosting a big tournament like that, and how much that does for bringing your domestic players on. I know there's talks of a South Africa competition as well, but actually, unless New Zealand invest in their domestic game and their domestic competition, I feel like they're going to fall more and more behind, and the Sophie Devines aren't going to be around forever. And then they've got a huge burden and workload on Amelia Kerr.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, what's quite interesting is New Zealand actually got a really good result in one of the warm-up games. They bowled South Africa out for just 92, 92 over the entirety of the 20 overs, and chased that down pretty comfortably. You mentioned Lee Kasperick, quite an interesting selection because she was out in the cold for a while in international cricket. I think didn't play for a couple of years. Now back in. I guess she's a type of bowler who we think might do particularly well in the UAE, slightly slower type of spin bowler. I wanted to ask just more generally on warm-up games, and a couple of other interesting results that we'll get to in a minute. Scotland beating Pakistan, Australia quite comfortably beating England. As a player going into a World Cup, how do you view warm-up games? Are they a dress rehearsal for a potential semi-final or something like that? Or are you using that as just game time to acclimatise yourself to conditions out there in the middle?
I think it honestly depends on the messaging from, the leadership group and the coach. I think some coaches and some groups purely view it as a stepping stone to being where we want to be. And even some of the group games in a World Cup is that we don't have to be perfect and nail our perfect game today. It's about progressively getting better as you progress through the groups, the finals, and it's about peaking in the final. Sometimes, whether some of the teams I've been involved in and coaches is like, no, we want to be ruthless from the minute we get off the plane. We're here and we mean business, and we're here to compete. So I honestly think different teams use it in different ways. You sort of look at a few of the warm-up games. South Africa, I know Laura Wolfart batted at 3. Will she bat at 3? Probably not. So they're tinkering. They're trying to see what their best combination is. Similar to New Zealand, I saw, Amelia Kerr open the batting. She's obviously batted predominantly at 3. So some teams will tinker, and other teams will really try to, like winning is a habit. Whether it's a warm-up game or not, people would rather win than lose. But yeah, I think it's a lot of them. It depends on the messaging from the group, and probably how much cricket and preparation you've had leading into it, based on what you can sort of expect from a warm-up game. If you're a couple of days off the plane and you've not been together for a group for a while, as a group for a while, your expectation might just be, let's just get out there and see where we're at. If really, if you're somebody like England that's been out there for a while, they probably played something close to what their team will be, in something close to roles, then they would have been looking to compete for sure.
Yeah, so Australia won that game by 33 runs. And you mentioned before we started recording something I guess will be really interesting to keep an eye on when we get to the business age of the tournament, is how teams approach Sophie Ecclestone, England's champion bowler. If you look at the scorecard from this game, she was up there with England's most expensive bowlers, 4 overs, 1 for 39. Charlie Dean bowled really well, 4 overs, 1 for 16. And you mentioned that actually Australia are not just targeting Ecclestone, they're doing it in a very specific way.
Yeah, I think it's something I can't remember where I heard it from, or whether it was just around sort of being in the big bash traps and things like that. But I certainly I remember in the 50 over World Cup, it was a thing where it was there was a real tactic of get the left-handers out there to face Sophie Ecclestone and look to be aggressive against her. Like we all know, that's just cricket, isn't it? The ball turning into a batter is an easier challenge than it is for the ball turning away. So if you've got left-handers at your disposal, it makes sense to sort of get your matchups right and to send them in against Sophie Ecclestone, because as a right-hander, you got Elise Perry, Ash Gardner, players, even Alyssa Healy. They won't want to face her. She's got pretty good record against, they're just 3 names, but against right-handers in particular. So I know that was certainly a tactic that was discussed and used, became pretty obvious, in especially in that 50 over World Cup. I guess a caveat to that is then how well Charlie Dean bowled, because that's the beauty of a bowling attack, isn't it? That you have options, and I think the best teams in the world have got somebody that can challenge one side of the bat, at either end. So if Sophie Ecclestone's under pressure, then that's where Charlie Dean picks up the slack. It's like anything, partnerships are key. So I think the rise of Charlie Dean will help that scenario. Because even if Sophie Ecclestone's expensive and people, like Australia, for example, may use, sending left-handed, you got Litchfield, you got obviously Beth Mooney. But then that's where, you'd hope somebody like Charlie Dean goes, it's all right, mate. Then the tactics unfold, isn't it? That's where you're basically trying to get them off strike to her and go, right, well, we want the left-hander, we want the offie to go at the left-hander. And you're sort of into the little nuances of the game then, aren't you? And how you manage that as a group and as a bowling partnership.
As a skipper in those situations, are you almost trying to keep a certain player on strike? If you've got a right hand, left hand combination in, and let's say Ecclestone is starting an over bowling to Mooney, are you almost like one is fine?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And look, it's that's something that in the 100 I would talk about. Look, I don't mind if we're getting ones here, because this is the matchup. This is the reason, that we've brought this player on to, it might be, use an example, you probably want to keep spin away from Danny Wyatt, but if you've got someone with half a yard of pace, and it's swinging early, as a lot of, Danny eats spin for breakfast, where I don't worry. I don't mind if we get one at the end of the over, if we get down the other end and we know that this is our matchup, because I think those moments are really crucial, especially if you look at things like if it's swinging early, it might not swing later on, or if it's a new ball and it's skidding on, or if it's actually then starting to turn. So the evolution of the game changes a lot as well. So you don't want to, and it might be that those windows now of sort of when a batter's fresh is getting smaller and smaller. It used to be you got 10 balls, but now it's you got 3 or 4 basically to try and get your matchup right and to put them under pressure because, as soon as somebody gets past 10 or 15 balls now, everybody's got options both sides of the wicket.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting going back to the warm-up game, just how deliberate the targeting of Eccleston was. The first 2 balls that Eccleston bowled were to Beth Mooney, and they both went for 4. I think 22 came off her first 2 overs, so like really on the attack against Eccleston from ball 1. More generally, where do you think Australia are at? I mean, their T20 World Cup record is totally absurd. I think they've won 6 of the last 7, and the only one they didn't win was when they were runners up to West Indies in 2016. It feels like they're potentially a little bit more fallible than they have been in the past. They lost the T20 leg of the Ashes last year. They've lost individual games to South Africa and West Indies in the last year as well. I've seen some people say that, you look at a team like England, and I know it doesn't come off every time, but England are trying to do something that gives them the best chance of success, and they're trying to bat with a bit more intent, a bit more aggression. And sometimes Australia can get caught in the middle a little bit. There was one game where they lost against South Africa where they hadn't actually lost that many wickets, but weren't going that quickly, and Grace Harris had to bail them out at the end of the innings. They got to a decent total, but it was one that South Africa chased down relatively easily. So where do you think Australia are at? Are they the resounding favourites of this competition, or what do you think the gap is?
No, I think I would agree with you in terms of they look more vulnerable than they have, and I think there's different elements to why that is. I think the first thing is probably Meg Lanning's captaincy. I just feel like there was so much belief in her as a leader that whatever call she makes and whatever happens in the game, it will be the right thing and we'll get the right result. I think we've seen more near misses under Alyssa Healy. And yeah, those things take time to build relationships, to build confidence in tactics in the group. It's like the changing of the guard, but actually the team hasn't changed an awful lot. So I think there was just such a belief and almost this invincibility about Meg Lanning and Matthew Mott era. And obviously there has been a fair bit of change in the leadership structure of Cricket Australia. I think the other thing is the side looks a bit random to me. I think Annabelle Sutherland's arguably one of the best all-rounders in the world at the minute, and I think she's lost where she's batting. And actually, do you miss the sweet spot of how good she can be because we don't get a chance to see how good she can be? And then you've sort of got some world-class players, but then you're using Georgia Wareham to bat 3 instead of Elise Perry to add potency to the batting lineup. But is that not your job of your batters to do that rather than to, do you know what, I think it's you're obviously concerned about the strike rate of some players, so you're trying to elevate players who will give it a good go, but it just seems a bit random. You've got a truckload of all-rounders, but I'm not sure how definitive the roles are. Where you look at somebody like I sort of see the way in which I and this is just completely my opinion, is you either pick people for the roles that you've got vacant, or you make people play the roles that your team needs. So, for example, you pick Yas Katya at 3 because how she is, who she is, how she plays fits the way in which that you want to play. Or you have a role that the player doesn't quite fit, but you're going to try and help make them play that role. And I'm sort of not sure which part Australia's sitting at the minute. Is, you probably want Elise Perry to be more aggressive, but she's not. So then you're trying to get Georgia Wareham to do it, but it's not really her role to do it, if that makes sense. So I still think they're a world-class unit, but it just looks a bit higgledy-piggledy to me. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, no, I think I do. I mean, someone like Sutherland, for example, she's shown what she can do in the bat throughout her career. She's batted once in the top 6 for Australian T20I cricket, which is kind of amazing for someone as good as her. And I sort of think, do you think that when we talk about matchups in the field, it's a bit simpler, right? You as a captain, you decide who's bowling and what your plans are based on who the batter is, and that's relatively straightforward. But if you get quite match-uppy with the bat, do you sometimes lose clarity in player roles? Like if we see it more in T20 cricket these days that batting orders can be flexible. Obviously, you're doing that for a reason, and that can work. It sort of worked for Australia in that warm-up game against England. But do you sometimes then lose the sort of, this is what your job is every time? And for a player, especially a middle order player, which is, a difficult role to be good at the better times in T20 cricket. But if you're 6 one week, you're batting 3 the next, depending on who's bowling for the opposition. Is that quite difficult for individual players?
I would imagine so, if they are the players, because I think especially sometimes in female sort of thinking and female athletes quite often tend to like structure and knowing what's going on. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think generally speaking, that's the way in which a lot of females operate. So that would cause unease to a degree of not knowing who's going when. You got the logistical nightmare of, is everybody sat in the dugout with the pads on? Waiting to have a go. But it is right. The matchups is a thing with the bat. You look at, I'll use a male example, but you're probably not sending out Glenn Maxwell if Lockie Ferguson's bowling, but you are sending him out to go and take down spin every day of the week. Within that, it's the batters doing the batting, so having a pinch hitting bowler, I don't know. It's just, I do think you get the matchups and you get some people who are higher strike rates against seam and spin, but I do still think, you've got your batters do the batting and your bowlers do the bowling. And it feels like there's a lot of like in between, you've got everybody does everything, but then nobody does anything sort of scenario.
Yeah. Where do you think India are as a side? I find them maybe the hardest one to work out because, again, lots of big names, really established players. Their records aren't great over the last couple of years, but equally you think a World Cup in the subcontinent, that should suit them, but equally they lost a home series against England less than a year ago. So yeah, I've struggled to work out where they are because I on one level think, yeah, they should be really strong in this tournament, but on the other hand, I look at their record and I'm like, well, actually, there's not a lot in the last year or so that says to me this is a team that's about to win a World Cup.
Yeah, I think on paper they should be absolutely up there to try and win a World Cup. I mean, obviously everybody's trying to win a World Cup, but I think on paper they could win the World Cup. As you said, we have no evidence to suggest that apart from the players that they've got on their sheet, in their squad. I think, I remember speaking to, I think it was Mel Jones and Katie Martin when I was out in the IPL, the WPL commentating. And we watched the Harmanpreet Kaur absolute massacre. And then even, the way Richard Ghosh played, Jemima Rodrigues, you just think, how is this team not got a global trophy? And the reason why I think they haven't got is their bowling attack for me. I think they haven't got an out-and-out strike seam bowler where it's, they've almost got that sort of just that experience and that know-how and the stats and results behind them. I think Pooja Vastreka's a fantastic all-rounder. Renuka Singh's quite hit and miss depending on if it's swinging. Dipti Sharma's arguably one of the most informed players in the world with bat and ball. But I think their batting lineup is as good as any team. Arguably better than most teams. The only two I would say is sort of England and Australia, and I think pound for pound India's top 6 is as good as. The issue I would think is, and the reasons why they probably haven't won a global competition thus far, is because of the bowling attack. And I think, people, you can outbat teams, but if you can't defend it with the ball and you're expensive with the ball or you're not threatening, you're going to find it hard. So I think I guess their method will have to be, in my opinion, is to outbat teams. And they can certainly do that. You look at their lineup, you've got Mandana, you've got Jemima Rodrigues, you've got Harmanpreet Kaur, Richard Ghosh, they're absolutely stacked. But they're going to have to score a lot of runs because I do think their bowling attack is weak when you look at who's going to challenge them the most. Well, England and Australia both have better bowling attacks. So they're going to have to go hard and keep going with the bat.
And finally, how different is World Cup cricket to other cricket, especially when you get to a business end of a competition? How much is it reacting conditions and almost, I don't know, like what is the difference in pressure at a the business end of a World
I think
Cup?
there's probably two elements of the World Cup that's very different. Is the constant adapting, because you never play the same team twice in a row, unless you get obviously back end and the people are coming round again. You're in a series, you get to problem solve as you go along, because if you have a good result in the first game or you don't, you can tinker, you can replan, and you go again for the next game in a series. A World Cup, it's constant adapting. No team presents the same challenge, back to back. It's quickly about parking and moving on to the next game, but equally, that any slip up will cost you. It sort of always feels like in a World Cup that you ease your way in, but then boom, 2 games in, you're like, goodness, every game counts now. And it's that feeling. Yeah, it is, and it's pressure. That's that we all know what pressure does to people, to athletes all around the world. But if there is a consequence, and a very large consequence, skills and mindsets are tested more than any other series competition in the world. So I think, there's different challenges with the constant change in the team that you'll play, and the differences amongst the teams. But it's the do or die, isn't it? That's ultimately what makes it so challenging, but so exciting at the same time, because I think cream always rises to the top in World Cups. Big players stand up. Teams that are absolutely deserve to be there will come out on top.
Who do you think will be the cream that rises to the top then?
I think it will be, and I've said this for a little while actually, I think it will be an India Australia final. Sorry, not India Australia, India England.
Okay, interesting. So that's interesting. Looking at the draw, so I think it's most likely. I think England should really top their group. So you're backing England. You think India are going to do Australia in the group?
Yeah,
England...
I have actually. I said that. I probably said that in the WPL. Yeah, so I think it will be an England-India final. I think India will pip Australia.
And you just think just because that Australia lineup isn't as settled as it should be at this point?
I just think in Australia look a little bit more vulnerable than they have, and a little bit less sure of themselves. And I think India are on the rise of putting together a really, like I said, I think that batting lineup's as good as any. And just the fact of the slow bowlers of India, Aussies like pace, and I think that somebody like Asher Sabana, the leg spinner, was a real handful in the WPL. It's almost like the slower bowling is more challenging for the Australians. So I just think in that sense, and to be honest, I think, so when you watch somebody like Harmanpreet Kaur for the Mumbai Indians, if she has a day out, and usually when there's a lot on the line, she single-handedly is up for it. And I think, they have a couple of match winners where we just know the power and the weight of a World Cup for India as well. Is that, will that just bring out some of those players just absolutely rising to the top and wanting to do whatever it takes. So yeah, I think that'll be the final, India England. But yeah, let's see what unfolds.
Yeah, let's see. I mean, the tournament kicks off on Thursday, Bangladesh versus Scotland in a day game in Sharjah, and then England are in action on Saturday against Bangladesh, and then again just 2 days after that against South Africa. It should be a fascinating tournament. Should be a fascinating start to the tournament. Lauren, cheers for your time. Catch you next week. Katya, first of all, do you want to explain the mismatch between the two groups, and can we try and work out how that happened?
Yeah, so we've been saying for a couple of weeks now that Group A is the much stronger group in the World Cup. Of course, England are in Group B, so actually have a easier group. Group A has Australia, India, New Zealand, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Those 6 are all in the top 8 of the ICC's T20 team rankings. So the only 2 not in that group who are in the top 8 are England and South Africa, who are in the other group. it's a bit unclear as to how the groups are drawn, although it does specify in a press release from the IC that they were drawn, so you would assume there's an element of seeding or randomness to the draw. But it does seem a bit counterproductive to have such a lopsided group in a way. There will normally be one strong group and one weak group, or if you have multiple groups, there'll be stronger groups and weaker groups. But this is the biggest case I can remember of it being this mismatched. I mean, a slip up from anyone, you can very much see Sri Lanka pulling one over one of the better quote-unquote teams in that group. So yeah, it just seems a little bit counterproductive to have that. You could potentially could have swapped even one of the teams and still had a stronger Group A, but not as mismatched a group as it is at the minute. I also think it's slightly down to the way that teams have developed over the last few months. So Sri Lanka have had quite a late kind of ascension to being one of the better teams in the tournament. The only real team you can see in that group is probably not on the cards to win a match at the minute is Pakistan. So it's kind of a quirk of this World Cup and what's happened over the last 6 months, but it should have been avoidable to have a group as this lopsided as it is.
Yeah, it's worth saying that this is the case for basically every ICC tournament. It's amazing how India and Pakistan always end up in the same group at every ICC tournament. Luck of the draw, eh? We're going to pick out a player to watch from each team. We're not necessarily going to pick out the most obvious players. I guess these are players who you might not know that much about, or players who we think might make a particular difference. Katya, do you want to start with players from Group A?
Yeah, so let's start with Australia because they're the boring ones. My initial thought when I was thinking about this was Phoebe Litchfield because she's had such a kind of short run into Australia's first choice T20 side. She did really well against New Zealand and that kind of broke her into the Australia 11 that's really hard to get into. But I actually want to talk about Annabelle Sutherland because I think she is genuinely one of the players to watch in this tournament. She was in Australia's squad last tournament but barely played. And over the last kind of 18 months, she's really become one of the best players in the world. Like, she was outstanding against both India and Bangladesh in T20Is this year. And it's nuts for me that she doesn't bat higher as well. You think this is a player with test hundreds, double hundred in the Ashes, and she can barely break into Australia's top 6. She's a brilliant death bowler as well. I think her economy over the last 12 months has been 6.86 at the death, which is really, really good. She bowls a lot of variation. She's got a very good slower ball bouncer. And her career, I really see her as a future captain of Australia, someone who's going to go on and dominate the scene for the next decade. And I think this is the start of that.
Moving on, who have you got next?
So India, initial thought on this one was Shreyanka Patil, who was the leading wicket taker in the Women's Premier League earlier this year.
She's been one of the real stars of that competition, uncapped when the competition began, that sort of rose to prominence. I think helped being at RCB, a team that's quite good at I guess generating fandom around their stars as well. Yeah, she's really risen since then. She took 4 for 12 in the final last year, decimated Delhi Capital's tail and got rid of Meg Lanning as well. And then earlier this year, she took 2 for 19 against Australia in the T20I that India won. And she's the newest part of this kind of pretty experienced India T20 spin attack that also has Radha Yadav and, of course, Dipti Sharma. They've got a lot of bases covered in that spin attack, and she's kind of solidified this side that's got very entrenched roles now. So what I've always thought with India in T20 World Cups and major tournaments past is they've gone in not really knowing what their best 11 is, but with Shreyanka Patil in it and then a very fixed top 6 in Verma, Mandana, Kaur, Rodriguez, Ghosh, Dipti Sharma, plus Renuka Singh Thakur as the best seam bowler in the world pretty much, and that 3-pronged spin attack, that's an incredibly strong side. It's worth also just, I mentioned Richa Ghosh there, it's also just worth mentioning she's having an incredible year in T20I. She averages 48 and she's striking at 157. So she's another one to have an eye on as one of the younger India players. A lot of people are tipping India. They think this is the time for India to make that breakthrough. Why do you think they might not do it? Because if you actually look at their record since the last World Cup, it's not great. Yet a lot of people watch them and look at that top 6 in particular, look at the spin attack that you mentioned, and think they should win it. or at least be a serious challenge to Australia. But their record's not as good as you might think, given the talent they've got.
Yeah, on paper, you can look at that side and go, yeah, well, they would be the best ones of having a chance to beat Australia. But they've struggled at the death. They've also struggled with strike rates, and they've struggled in terms of being the side to get over the line in those high pressure situations. Of all the sides kind of you would tip that could win the tournament, in those high pressure situations, India have often come up short. You think about the semi-final from last year's tournament when they should have won that match, and then Harmanpreet Kaur gets run out and they collapse from there. They've also historically not been a good fielding side, and in T20s that really, really matters, especially in World Cups. But I think there have been some positive signs despite their record over the last few months. Their strike rates, for example, which have also been historically a problem with the bat, have really, really increased. So potentially India have a better chance this year than they have had before, even though their record this year hasn't been that great.
And then Sri Lanka, who I've got is more likely to get through than New Zealand.
Yeah. Sri Lanka, as I said earlier, they've been on a really good run in the last kind of 12 months. They beat England at home last year, and then they beat Ireland as well in the last month. Obviously, Chamari Atapattu, don't need to, that's very self-explanatory as to why she's the one to watch from Sri Lanka. But I also want to talk about Hasitha Samarawikrama, who's averaged 49 in T20 since the last World Cup. Her strike rate as well, which has always been Sri Lanka's problem, which is why I think they're going to have a better tournament this year, has significantly increased, well above 100 from the kind of low 90s that it was sitting at before this. This year alone, she scored T20I half centuries against South Africa, India and Ireland. She also scored an ODI century against Ireland the match after the Vishnu Gunaratne became the second Sri Lanka player to score a century in women's ODI, breaking Chamari Atapattu's record of scoring 8 and being the only player to ever score one. So she's been ridiculous this year, and giving Sri Lanka a player apart from Chamari Atapattu to rely on is really significant. Because even if you have another couple of names in that side who can stand up alongside Atapattu, or when Atapattu doesn't do it for them, that makes Sri Lanka an instantaneously far stronger side, and someone that sides will have to take extremely seriously. I also don't think we can mention Sri Lanka without another mention for 15-year-old spinner Shashini Gimbani, who we are becoming a fan club of on this podcast.
I'm worried she might not play, having seen her involvement in the warm-up games.
I'll be devastated.
There was one warm-up game where loads of players bowled and she wasn't one of them. So maybe they're just wrapping her up in cotton wool for the big stuff. What about New Zealand? Earlier on in the show, Lauren talked about how they've sort of stalled as a side. If you're looking for hope as a New Zealand fan, outside of the more established names like Devine, Bates and Kerr, who are you looking for?
Yeah, it's a really tough one to kind of look at as to how New Zealand are shaping up. I was thinking about how dominant England were in the series over here, and then looking at the UAE, I was thinking maybe the pitches there might bring them into play a little bit more. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to happen in the warm-up game that England were playing against them again.
It must be sick of the sight of England.
11, 12, 13 matches in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. But they've got actually quite a good spin attack, which is why I picked out Fran Jonas as my one to watch for them for this World Cup. Following the New Zealand series, following the series in England, she took 4 for 22 at Lords, which was her career best and the only match that England kind of looked thoroughly threatened in. And her, together with Eden Carson, they make up this kind of young and promising New Zealand spin attack alongside obviously Amelia Kerr.
And Lee Kasprick, I think it's fascinating that she's back. She was basically jettisoned for a couple of years, now back ahead of a tournament where her type of bowling will probably be really effective.
Yeah, exactly. And New Zealand have often brought in very, very young players and then stuck with them even when people think they shouldn't. And Lee Kasprick is an example of a different approach where they've actually gone back to someone and said, no, your time with New Zealand isn't over. And also brought someone who's kind of a specialist in for these kinds of conditions. Yeah,
I mean, just using Jonas as an example for that point, 20 years old, but she's already played 58 times for New Zealand, made her debut as a 16-year-old back in early 2021. That leaves Pakistan. We were talking about it before the pod. They are arguably the weaker side on paper in the tournament. They lost against Scotland in a warm-up game, so that perhaps suggests that point might be true.
Yeah, I don't think it's that inarguable to say that they are the weaker side in the tournament. They've had a terrible run over the last couple of years. They've lost a couple of really high-profile players. And when we talk about New Zealand stagnating in development, I think Pakistan have actually taken a downward turn in development rather than pushing forward. There's an interesting story in Saida Aroob Shah in the Pakistan squad, though. She made her international debut at 16 in 2019 and basically just wasn't very good. Lost her place, and then had a really good run in domestic cricket in Pakistan and was captain of their side in the Under-19 World Cup last year, which is kind of mad to think you had a captain in the Under-19 World Cup who made their international debut 4 years before that tournament actually happened. And it's going to be hard. This is going to be a really difficult World Cup for Pakistan. Potentially it's the kind of tournament that sides need in terms of breaking the back of, we can't do this anymore, this is the way to go forward. For example, there's been a women's PSL floated in Pakistan for a number of years now, and that's not come to fruition. And when you think about what really enhances development for sides, it's when franchise and proper T20 leagues come in. You can look at, even in the 2 years the WCPL has been running, the development in the West Indies side is incredible. The 100, the WPL has propelled India further and further, and perhaps this will be the time that the demand for the women's PSL will really kick off.
In Group B, let's go alphabetically. So let's start with Bangladesh. I think perhaps similar to Sri Lanka, Bangladesh are going to be a story to watch over the next few years. So if you look at the Under-19 World Cup that took place in early 2023, they topped a group with Australia in it. They beat Australia. They effectively finished 5th in that tournament, and they're bringing through the group of players who got them that far in the tournament. So 5 players in this World Cup squad were part of that Under-19 squad. A player I'm going to pick out is Rabea Khan, 19-year-old leggy, part of that World Cup Under-19 World Cup squad last year. She's already played 40 odd times for Bangladesh. She's got an amazing record, averages 15. More interestingly, her economy rate is at about 5 runs and over. She bowls weird leg spin. It's sort of flicky out of the front of the hand, almost finger spin leg spin rather than with the wrist. I can envisage her being quite a hard player to face if you've not come across her a lot. And we're talking before the show, one team that haven't played Bangladesh very much, England, we looked earlier, have never played Bangladesh in a game outside a World Cup. And, you know, that's kind of extraordinary. And I think we'll look into this after the tournament, but part of me wonders if some teams that are stronger in women's cricket are punished. Obviously, we covered this with the top associate sides, with this happening to them because of this. But teams like Bangladesh probably don't play the top teams enough for how good they are, because their men's side, historically speaking, have been weaker. I think Bangladesh are a team who, if you look at the rankings, the ODI rankings, for example, they're actually quite a long way ahead of someone like Pakistan, who obviously had a tour to England earlier this year.
I think you can also say with the T20 rankings, Bangladesh are not ridiculously far off Pakistan in the T20 rankings, and England seem to play Pakistan a fair amount. So it's interesting that they don't also play Bangladesh.
Yeah. Just a bit more on Bangladesh. So Romana Ahmed, who's been a mainstay of the team for best part of a decade, she was dropped not just from the 11 but from the squad. Chief selector Sajjad Ahmed said, we selected Romana in the Asia Cup where unfortunately she didn't perform. She's a middle order batter who isn't batting the way that is needed in T20. So that's quite a bold call, dropping one of their more established players on the eve of a World Cup. England, we've obviously talked about them loads. I went for Bouchier because it's her first tournament as a first choice player, and if she can find form and get England off to a few flyers, that could be a game changer, particularly as we get to the business end of the tournament. And I think that we know what we'll get, broadly speaking, from Wyatt Hodge, Sivert Brunt, Eccleston, etc. And I think what will define England's tournament is how that new core underneath the established senior players does. And there's a lot of them who are pretty young, very much in the first half of their international careers, who we know are really talented, but do they put a stamp on the World Cup? I think that will be what defines England, especially when you get potentially in a semi-final against Australia or a final against India, something like that. They can't just rely on the same players who produce their results for them historically. Scotland, before I say who I'm looking forward to, they had an amazing result the other day.
Yeah, Scotland beat Pakistan in one of the first warm-up matches for the competition, which, as we said, kind of confirms where Pakistan stand. No disrespect to Scotland, but it does confirm where Pakistan stand in the kind of tournament rankings. That would be the one side you would have said, if Pakistan were where they historically have been, you would expect them definitely to win. But it also wasn't like Pakistan just got completely bowled out for a really low total and Scotland were able to chase it down. Pakistan scored 132 for 9, 3 wickets for Catherine Bryce, and Scotland chased it down really easily. 2 overs to spare, 2 wickets down. Sarah Bryce 60 not out off 52. Saskia Hawley as well, another opener, 48 off 42. And kind of just a clinical performance, nothing kind of out of the ordinary about it than a run of the mill win, which is almost the most impressive thing about it. You'd think Scotland's best chance of winning a game in this tournament would be to pull one over on Bangladesh or perhaps South Africa, West Indies and England, but that was kind of demonstrative that they are a much better side than they would appear on paper.
Yeah, I think Scotland are definitely more than capable of springing at least one surprise. You know, we talked a lot about the Bryce sisters. What's really encouraging in this game is that they were chasing a decent total, yet it wasn't just the Bryce sisters who got them there. Sarah Bryce gets 60, but Saskia Hawley, someone who's not played a lot of international cricket for Scotland, I think she's quite an interesting player. She's got background playing a lot of cricket in Australia under 19. She's played WBBL, so that's real added firepower up top. The player I was going to pick out was Catherine Fraser, 19-year-old off spinner who also bats, because I think they've got the makings of a really good and well-rounded attack. Catherine Bryce will obviously take the new ball, as will Rachel Slater, who plays a lot of domestic cricket in England, left-arm seamer. We've seen a lot of Abtaha Maqsood as well in English domestic cricket. We know she's really good. So I think if Fraser can sort of add balance to that attack, spinning the ball in the other direction to Maqsood, I think that could make quite a big difference, and I can see them being quite a hard team to get a significant score against. We mentioned a couple of times that they have the misfortune of having, I think, maybe 3-day games in the Sharjah heat. That leaves South Africa and the Windies. For South Africa, in a weird place, I guess, finalists in 2023. But probably not tipped to go that far this time round. I'd still say they're favourites to get through in this group, as you mentioned, probably a slightly weaker group than Group A. I'm going to go with someone who we talked about, I think, on last week's pod, Annerie Dirksen. Very little international cricket behind her, but there's one number that stands out for me, that strike rate of 151. It's a small sample size, sure, but it looks like she's being deployed as a proper finisher, a role that few teams have really. And in a team that, you know, it's not been a particularly stable couple of years, having an injection of youth lower down could be quite a big deal for them. So interesting to see how she goes in this tournament. And that leaves West Indies, who, again, Katya, they had quite an interesting warm-up game result.
Yeah, it was brilliant, actually. So West Indies were playing Australia, which I guess is the warm-up match you don't really want when you play Australia. I mean, Ireland beat them in the warm-ups last year, which was pretty cool, but I guess you don't want to be thrashed first up. West Indies were going to win this match, so they limited Australia to 144 for 8 in the first innings. And at one point, it looked like they were going to bowl them out, but Alana King hit 21 off 13 balls down the order. Alia Lane was great, so was Affy Fletcher, obviously Hayley Matthews as ever, Zayda James. And West Indies, they lost Keena Joseph at the 10 over mark, but they were 92 for 1 and they were going to win that match, and they lost 9 wickets for 17 runs.
Suboptimal.
Yeah, exactly. No one got into double figures apart from the 2 openers. But yeah, Alana King took 4 wickets and they were all out for 109. 3 separate bowlers were on hat-tricks at one point, and Alana King took the final 2 wickets of the match in 2 balls. So yeah, I was really excited watching it, thinking, the West Indies are going to properly do one over on Australia again, but not to be, which was really upsetting. Yeah,
no, that is a shame, but also encouraging for the West Indies in that, you know, a lot of the pre-tournament chat has been, well, they're very reliant on Matthews, Stefani Taylor, Deandra Dottin, but actually, you know, first of all, Stefani Taylor didn't even play that game. Hayley Matthews got runs. Deandra Dottin without first ball to Sutherland. So it's encouraging that actually Kiana Joseph up top scored, and she scored quickly as well, 36 off 29, quicker than Matthews did actually, 4-4s, 1-6. The player I was going to pick out, you mentioned her earlier, is Afi Fletcher, the veteran leg spinner. She's got a really good record over the last few years, and I think similar to, I guess, a team like New Zealand, how West Indies will go. Like the difference between them potentially scraping through and actually challenging the best teams more consistently is how do the players are rung below the superstars fare. And Afi Fletcher's got a world of experience behind her. She looks like she's in really good form. She bowls a type of leg spin that I think will go quite well in the UAE. So if she goes well, I reckon that'll be a big boost for the West Indies. Very quickly, Lauren, we heard that Lauren doesn't think that Australia are going to win the tournament. She doesn't even think they're going to make the final. Katya, who do you think is going to win the thing, and who do you think is going to make the final?
I wrote a piece today essentially agreeing with Lauren that I didn't think Australia were going. It wasn't that I don't think Australia were going to win it. I think they probably will win it. But if there was any year that Australia weren't going to win the T20 World Cup, it would be this year.
Yeah.
For a whole host of reasons that Lauren has kind of outlined. I do think it will still be Australia that will win the tournament. I don't think England are going to make the final.
Mm-hmm.
I think it will be an India-Australia final, and I think Australia will likely win that.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. I think Australia are the favourites, but I think that if either England or India find really good form, if players like Bouchier have a really good tournament, if either Gibson or Kemp down the order has a really good tournament, I think that changes things quite a lot. But yeah, I don't think Australia are as settled as they could be. I sort of, almost from like a neutral cricketing point of view, I sort of want it to be India, in terms of like they have such stylish batters in the top six. I want them to have good tournaments, and I think if they do have good tournaments, they'll be very hard to stop. But yeah, I'd say just Australia, and then India just behind them, and England just behind them. But I think it'll be a fascinating tournament, and I'm really excited for it.
It's got to be the closest one in a number of years, though.
I think so. I think the gap between Australia and the rest is probably the smallest it's been for a long time. Even though we're both saying Australia are favourites, and even though Lauren said she doesn't think Australia are going to win it, I think she would acknowledge that, looking at everything, they are probably the favourites objectively. But yeah, I don't think they have been as close to the pack as they have been in a long time, partly due to Lanning not being involved. But it does feel like, they haven't, as you say with Sutherland, they haven't quite got the best out of, a potential young superstar. They probably haven't made the intent jump that other teams below them have. And who knows, in all it takes in a World Cup game is one of these immensely talented players who is batting at an intent that the Aussies might not quite be, to just have a day out, and then suddenly you're chasing 170 in a World Cup semi-final, and you're suddenly in a lot of trouble. So yeah, I think Australia, the gap is smaller than it has been, I think. Anyway, that is it for today's show. Cheers, Katya. Thanks, listeners. And a reminder, we will have daily episodes for you after every England game at the World Cup on our Patreon. So sign up and get involved. Remember to head to Metro Bank's social channels to watch Metro Bank business customer Sophie meet with England players Lauren Bell, Kate Cross and Sarah Glenn, where they chat about who's inspired them and how Metro Bank is supporting women in cricket and in business.